with all the things going on in the world right now, war in Iran, ICE, immigration issues, just the general state of insanity in the White House, I've been thinking a lot lately about what it was like before. And I'm not even sure what I mean when I say before. It's kind of like before what? But I wanted to share some thoughts with you today from the writer's cabin. Do you remember when the White House was occupied with presidents who didn't ever seem to make much news? Like you could go a few days and the president might explain why he was giving loans to the American car industry to save it, or maybe he had a plan to provide more health care to all Americans, or maybe he had to decide on a new cabinet secretary. Maybe he was explaining why he had to send money to a state hit by a hurricane or a town wrecked by a flood. Do you remember those days? When we had a functioning FEMA, when they actually gave money to help us desperate Americans. It was all very routine, at least most of the time. Or at least that's the way it felt, right? The color of his clothing, a brown man wearing a light brown suit, was the outrage of the day. Maybe he opposed a piece of legislation or was pushing something one side or the other didn't want, but it never seemed as though his decision was existential. And maybe it was a policy on one side or the other that the others didn't like, but it never seemed a decision he was making to enrich himself, to benefit himself. Remember those days? Do you remember when Fox News used to criticize the president because Sleepy Joe was so sleepy? Now, this same group of people defend a sleeping president. You try to convince us he's just resting his eyes. In short, this sleepy president doesn't seem to bother them much anymore. I remember a lot of these things. Do you remember when we all believed our elections were fair and nobody ever questioned them? That was sometime in before 2016, about the time we started to hear from the current occupant of the White House. That's when we started to hear we couldn't trust our fellow Americans who ran the elections. They were all cheaters. Stealing was the word he used. Do you remember a few years later when that same president asked a fellow Republican to find him 11,780 votes so he could be president again? Further back, do you remember when we thought Mitt Romney was the radical and dangerous guy? And then Mitt Romney proved over the next few years that he wasn't as dangerous as the other guy? Some might say Mitt was patriotic. He even seemed decent and kind. The Republican our dad would have voted for if he was still here. Do you remember when we all used to hate on Liz Cheney and suddenly didn't hate her anymore because we saw her put the country before party? And do you remember how her fellow voters didn't like that? And they threw her out of office. Do you remember when a Republican named George H.W. Bush told us immigrants weren't bad for our country and they deserved respect and a path to self-respect? Remember that campaign video? And you remember when he became president? And do you remember that when he merely said no new taxes and it cost him a second term? One promise not kept. That was it. Not 30,000 documented lies like the new guy. Just one lie. And can you remember when his son, another proud Texan, won the White House? There was a debate about hanging Chads, and then a Supreme Court ruling, and presto, he was our leader. And do you remember we all accepted it? Because then we still trusted the Supreme Court to make a fair decision, even if we didn't like the outcome. Remember those times? And you remember when we all laughed and we just knew that we'd never seen somebody as dumb in the White House, and we'd never see somebody as dumb in the White House ever again. And do you have a memory of 9/11 and how the dumb baseball guy first pulled us together, standing on the rubble of the Twin Towers? And even the cynics like me thought, well, at least he fucking showed up. And maybe he isn't as dumb as he sounds. And then remember he told us Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and then how he started a war there, and we all knew he was dumber than we once thought he was just a few weeks before. Remember that? How he used a respected black man, heroic general from his daddy's war, to lie to the United Nations and validate his lie. And remember how that war, along with Our failed efforts in Afghanistan cost us trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives. And how Iraq was all for oil, and how the younger Texans' decision killed tens of thousands of innocent people for no reason whatsoever. Light-skinned brown people mostly. Do you remember how we eventually stayed long enough to create a vacuum in leadership in Iraq? Second order effect that spurred on a new group of terrorists that we like to call now ISIS. Do you remember Bill Clinton and how his lying about getting oral sex from a 22-year-old intern caused Congress to impeach him unsuccessfully, but they still tried. One lie. Not a pedophile. Just sex between two adults. Adultery for certain. But with a 14-year-old girl? Like in the Epstein files? No, that wasn't Bill, was it? And it wasn't Sleepy Joe, and it wasn't Obama. They never made it into the Epstein files. Do you remember when we fought those wars, how we worked with dozens of countries to make sure the United States wasn't going it alone, to make sure we weren't wrecking the whole oil markets around the world, to make sure we had enough firepower to win, to make sure our Gulf partners were on board attacking another Muslim country? Remember that? It's almost like these people that ran wars before us knew a little bit more about what we're seeing now. And remember when they allowed reporters to see if we were winning or losing? When they held daily press conferences with reporters from CNN and AP and NPR and CBS and NBC and ABC and the Washington Post inside the Pentagon, where real reporters worked for decades? Now it's TV station with Mike Lindell, the pillow guy, asking questions about war. Lindell TV, he calls it. Really? Look it up. Or Matt Gaetz, sitting in the Pentagon press room, who left Congress when he learned a report about him having sexual relations with a teenager was about to be released. Or Laura Loomer, sitting in the press briefing room with her pen and notebook and plastic surgery. I guess what I'm really wondering is, do you remember our Pentagon never would have allowed a charade like this? Do you remember when the Republicans were Family Values Party before they were Protecting Pedophiles Party? Remember that? Can you guys recall when Saddam Hussein was the enemy, when Kim Jong-un was the enemy, when Vladimir Putin was the enemy, when people like Viktor Orban of Hungary were the enemy? Dictators were enemies. Do you remember that far back? When we fought dictators for the right reasons. Now, mostly we embrace them. Now we create them from within. I guess what I'm asking is, do you remember when we would never vote to have a dictator run our country? When 37% of the country didn't want a dictator? Do you remember when our president trusted his own intelligence service over Vladimir Putin? Do you folks remember when Canada was a friend? Do you remember when bridges between two countries were a good thing and not a political football? A bridge. Do you remember when NATO wasn't a dirty word? Do you remember when they defended us, all of us, when terrorists attacked our towers? How they all went to war for us when nobody had attacked them. Do you remember that? Do you remember when we didn't hate people who made our food? Do you remember when we didn't hate people who cleaned our hotel rooms? Do you remember when people working in the car wash were worthy of a nice little tip and not a trip to a detention center? Do you remember when making people sleep on a concrete floor wasn't an acceptable way of treating our fellow man? When a real blanket instead of a Mylar one was worthy of someone's dignity? Do you remember when our government didn't drive up to a bus stop or a laundromat or a schoolyard or a restaurant with brown people inside and take them all away in dark vans? Do you remember when losing children was a crime? Do you remember when July 4th was still fun? We loved the fireworks, didn't we? The fireworks, the hot dogs, that once beautiful flag, 3 colors, and how we knew its colors of red, white, blue meant we had the world's back. World War I, World War II, we had its back. Remember when people weren't offended when you said Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays? Because it all meant we'd be opening presents and seeing Uncle Jimmy or Grandma Moore or hearing Stanley Newton's Old World English and hear him talk about how he fought in 2 world wars to keep the Germans at bay and how he fought Nazis because the world depended on us sticking together. Remember when we didn't embrace Nazis and people who acted like them? Remember when church was just a place to play at youth group, going caving, lock-ins. Remember lock-ins? A place to eat after Mass. Pancakes, eggs, cinnamon buns, at long plastic tables in a church gymnasium. Do you remember when the name of your church wasn't divisive? When everyone at the service turned side to side in their pews, looked each other square in the eyes, shook hands, and said, "Peace be with you." And they meant it. I'm agnostic now, but I do remember when nobody knew the term Christian nationalist. It wasn't a thing. Do you remember the separation of church from the government? When commanders didn't say to our leader was anointed by God Almighty. Remember that? When a president was just a guy that we elected? And that nobody thought he was above the law. Certainly not the Supreme Court. Certainly not his party. Definitely not the rest of us. Certainly not those who fought so hard for so long against big government, only to watch the new guy pass this thing called the Big Beautiful Bill. Certainly not them. Especially not them. Remember them? Do you remember when Republicans revered Ronald Reagan? How they called him the best president ever, and now his followers are considered traitors, rhinos, Republican in name only. That's their names now. Do you remember a time before rhinos, before the Tea Party, before MAGA? Seems like such a long time ago, doesn't it? A long time ago. Do you remember baseball? Do you ever think about apple pie versus cherry pie anymore? Do you remember a time when we jumped our bikes over our friends laying on the pavement in the front street without helmets? And then our mom called us to dinner and we just threw our bikes in the front yard and ran inside. Do you remember when our moms and dads simply sat down at that table, mashed potatoes, steak, green beans, and didn't talk about how the man in the White House was a liar or a narcissist or crazy, or how he paid off a porn star to win an election, or how he lied 21 times a day? That's a real number, by the way. And how he hired the dumbest of the dumb so he could feel smart. Do you remember those days when a dinner was about school or soccer practice or a pep rally, or how Dad was going to take us all camping so we could catch some fish and let the dog run in the woods? When we didn't have leaders who thought it was okay to shoot our dogs. Do any of us remember those days? Or when we used to go out for ice cream on Friday nights at a Dairy Queen, or my favorite, the homemade ice cream and pie kitchen in Louisville, Kentucky, when it was humid and the lines were out the door, and you took a number and waited, and there was no cell phones to look at, no apps, just the stereo, and dozens of flavors to look at. Nobody talked of the politics or the president, just the fucking ice cream. When we got older, when we went out for a drink with friends to forget the world for a night, it was okay then to forget the world for a night. Things like insurrections or war with Venezuela, or a war with Iran, or a potential war with NATO, or stealing Greenland, or letting a friend lose a war to an enemy because our president loves the dictator more than he loves actual democracy. Do you remember when the president said Obama would get us into a war with Iran? And that he never did do that. Remember that? Do you remember a time when there was no such thing as cryptocurrency, when the president of the United States fought for the dollar to rise, not to replace it with a family business which aims to make the dollar obsolete and crashing our economy, and all our savings we have worked a lifetime in the process to keep and hold? Hey, here's one. Do you remember when guns used to protect us from bad people, quote unquote? And then they seem more used to kill children in their schools. By the way, I own guns. Do you remember when people who owned guns could say we still needed some better gun laws around who owned those guns? Do you remember when candidates said Trump should release his tax records? And he said he was going to release his tax records like all the other candidates did. Because he was being audited, he said he couldn't. But he would, just as soon as he could. And do you remember that years went by and he never did? And then someone leaked them. And then Trump sued his own government because someone released the documents he had promised to release a few years ago in the first place. Because, well, he never really wanted us to see them, did he? Do you remember when we knew the word hypocrite meant? Like he said he loved Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, and he met with him in person in his first term, and they exchanged love letters. Trump loved the letters so much, he tried to keep them for his own. And in 2016 and 2017, when Trump was president, Kim's government declared they had nuclear weapons. And Trump forgot all about keeping nukes out of the hands of dictators. Until this past year, when spurned on by Benjamin Netanyahu, who's going on trial for fraud, he suddenly was worried about people having nuclear weapons again. And the Epstein files. And he's suddenly worried about people having nuclear weapons again. Do you remember recently when we passed the law to shed light on the pedophiles and he signed it? And do you recall him suddenly saying we've had enough discussion on the Epstein files before he and his friends were exposed? Do you remember way back when the people who own the media cared more about truth and facts than they are being billionaires? When there were guys named Murrow and Cronkite, when people owned newspapers with names like Graham or Bingham, before there were media companies and hedge funds, before there were media companies whose people had names like Murdoch or Musk or Bezos at the helm, or newbies to the media landscape with names like Ellison and Weiss. When the Washington Post still let our membership afford a sports section, or a book review, or an original photo taken by the photographers because photos still mattered. Do you remember that? I call it TPBB, the post before Bezos. Do you remember when the president had dogs? Do you remember when the White House dinners were never McDonald's? Do you remember presidents of old, how they never needed to name things after themselves because that's not normal? Do you remember Roe v. Wade and the Civil Rights Act and voting rights and clean water? Do you remember when the president named the WWE executive to lead the fucking Department of Education? Or how he wants to name a plumber with no terrorism or law enforcement experience to protect us from terrorists coming to our shores? Right now, when we're at war with a terrorism state. Or how he named Robert Kennedy Jr., a vaccine denier, to run our health care despite never being a scientist or a doctor? Do you remember when all these questions began to make us think about the past and accountability and the rule of law and what was right and what was wrong? And how it may not have been perfect before with all those times in the way, all those things in the way. But those times never seemed as desperate as right now. So desperate that you wake up in the middle of the night and finish these thoughts because you couldn't sleep, because the same people who don't care about catching pedophiles who rape little girls here at home are the same people who don't care when we drop bombs on more little girls in their elementary schools far away. Remember that kind of insanity? Used to surprise us, shock us even. I remember. It was when we met Donald Trump, when he decided to run our once sacred office and live in our once sacred house, the house where great men slept with their families, great men who had dogs and cats, and smart people walking around the hallways, wives who maybe weren't as pretty, but whom didn't do centerfold spreads either. They had dignity and didn't steal other first lady speeches to sound smart. They didn't rip up rose gardens. That time, before there was him, with his spray-on tan and his fat ankles and his sagging pants from Depends. The reason we have a hard time remembering all these things, these once sacred things, is because he's here now and we're overwhelmed. He's the illness that makes us not remember. His cult calls it Trump derangement syndrome, when smart people and kind people and real patriots try to remind us of all the filth. We're the sick ones, not the ones sporting red hats, not the liars and hypocrites. They hate books. You notice that? And free thought. And they hate people with dark skin who vote. They hate the First Amendment, but they love the second one. They love gerrymandering in Texas, but they hate it in California. They love building ballrooms and walls, but love tearing down institutions even more, the Kennedy Center, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Education. Do you remember when we were normal? Remember? Cherry pie versus apple pie, big debate. Walking the dog. Just going to a concert. Bruce Springsteen singing ballad after ballad of Americana. Muscle Cars, Romancing a Bartender. You remember those songs? This one verse from one of his songs hits me the hardest, especially now that we've lost our way. The song's called Long Walk Home. Here's a couple verses. My father said, son, we're lucky in this town. It's a beautiful place to be born. It just wraps its arms around you. Nobody crowds you. Nobody goes it alone. Your flag flying over the courthouse means certain things are set in stone. We are who we are, what we'll do, and what we won't. Now, that guy in the White House says Bruce is highly overrated, dumb as a rock. A dried up prune of a rocker. Look how far we've fallen. Thanks, Misfits. Like, follow, and share. Comment if you want. I know it's only an opinion piece, but it's my opinion.